Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to see every one of you, and we have very warm atmosphere here inside. And I am so grateful to our beautiful sister who played for us today and made so beautiful music that we could sing. And of course, with music, we sing much joyfully. And today we are going to study our next sermon. And as we finished already with the first book of Samuel, we will go to the second book of Samuel. Today is our 8th sermon on David's life. And first of all, I would like to say that we have the title of the sermon here, Go Up. And it's a very short phrase, which I took from the text. So today we will study the first 5 chapters of second book of Samuel. And somewhere in the middle of this passage, I found this short phrase which God says to David. He says, "Go up, David." And of course, you know that after all the difficulties of his life, after all the tragedies and difficult circumstances and all darkness and all life in the desert, he probably would be quite much stressed and grieving. However, even in this moment, God says, "Go up." And the history is full of examples when the story starts great in the beginning, but then ends up badly. And very rarely we have the opposite. When story, what's happening? You don't know? Yes, the second book of Samuel, we will study from chapter 1 to chapter 5. We will not read every verse in this passage, but I will give you on the screen the verses we really need. And there are stories that despite the overwhelming obstacles, everything finds finally its happy ending. And our story today is that example. So we'll talk about the shepherd king, the different king, different from the other kings. We're talking about David for almost a year, and he is really a hero to speak of in details. How did he manage to gain so much authority in Israel? A shepherd yesterday, he became a military general, and soon he is to become a king. And I promise today we will finally see the point when David becomes a king over Israel. So today we study the material of 5 chapters. So we will find David, first of all, in the place where we left him before. He has just returned from pursuing Amalekites. He brought back all the captives and in Ziklag, and they started to rebuild their homes. You remember that Ziklag was looted and burned by Amalekites. It is not an easy to rebuild your life once again from the ashes. Yet people are happy to see their loved ones whom they counted lost, but now they are found. So people know God does care of them. Their lives are preserved, and the other things are easy to rebuild. And at this moment, though David is very busy to rebuild Ziklag and to settle there, though he is very busy, he makes one very important action. So let's read. When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." And David sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Yatir. And so we have the list of places where David sent the gifts. And they were goods they probably would need rebuilding Ziklag. However, David was very generous. He knew that he was dwelling in Judah, in those land, on that territory for a long time. They were his countrymates, and they supported him during the difficult times. So now the time has come to send them gifts. And there is a long list of cities and their names. And at the end, in verse 31, we have, and Hebron. Just remember it. Hebron comes at the very end of this list. And Hebron, and of those in all the other places where he and his men had roamed. This was an element of courtesy, as well as the report of his military success. The towns of Judah suffered from Amalekites for many years. Now they sighed out. Their savior, David, overtook their enemies. Not only this, David was generous enough to send gifts and save them from hunger during the long winter, which was to come. When chariots with gifts were loaded and left Ziklag, people turned to rebuild their homes. And in the midst of their work, as they were worked for 2 days already, then watchmen came. They saw a figure approaching. They saw a man who said he is from Israeli camp. His poor look did not promise any good news. However, he insisted that he has a good news and a gift to present to David. This man was quickly brought before David. So what we read in the book of Samuel, after the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. So David was really moved to ask questions because he was interested to see Israel's success in a battle with Philistines. "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from the battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." While talking, a man was looking in David's eyes and waited for sign of joy and triumph. Yet David's eyes turned to reflect sadness and amazement. This whole message looked as very unpleasant surprise. The messenger was puzzled how to interpret it. For the messenger, Saul and Jonathan were the king and his firstborn. For David, it was personal tragedy. Jonathan, his best friend, was now dead. David was not there to help him. And now nothing can overturn the fate. So David didn't expect it to happen like this. He might think in his mind or hope that God will save faithful Jonathan and somehow overturn the fate towards him. So David began to doubt about what this man is talking, what the message is. Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" From this point on, the man tells his story. So he says, "It happened to be on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul leading on his spear with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me and said, and I said, "What can I do?" He asked me, "Who are you?" "An Amalekite," I answered. Then he said to me, "Stand here by me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive." So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord. We would not doubt and will take these words for true if we are not told that things had happened differently. So you know that the first book of Samuel ends with a description of the battle and death of King Saul in the very last chapter. So we just read it. But the first chapter of the second book of Samuel gives us quite different account of things. So in the previous chapter, we had been already given the true account of Saul's death. And I'm sure for 3,000 years already, every reader who comes across this place is wondering, where did the new account come from? And we turn a page back and reread. No, there was no Amalekite in the battlefield. The story tells different things. So now we know that the Amalekite who came to David says, "Lie." What is the purpose of lying? It is to say the man didn't waste his time and took an opportunity to build up his own career. He wants to become next to David, his advisor maybe, or whatever. He knew the dominating culture in the Middle Eastern nations. That was a culture when the rival parties compete for the throne to death. And when the goal is achieved, the newly proclaimed king annihilates the whole household of his fallen rival. So it's even sometimes called the blood feud. And this man believes that this is a good news he presents to David, together with gifts, the crown he brought him. However, it is a bad news for David, and he is not interested in crown in this way. So the man makes a fatal mistake. He did not know the heart of David. David was a man of different view of life. His behavior is revolutionary to his time. He does not participate in blood feud. David avoids it by all means, and we are given many examples of this. We are told it not once. He is a challenge to the way his society lives. The two books of Samuel, the second book of Samuel especially, describes David's final step to take the throne. And the book starts with making it clear that David does not use blood feud practice. In our passage from chapter 1 to 5, we are given it even twice. So this is the first case, and then in chapter 5, the second case comes straight before David becomes the king of whole Israel. David rejects all opportunities to participate in it. So you see, if something is mentioned twice in the Bible, it is very important, and it means that the author wants to emphasize for us this particular thing. So what the author wants to tell us, that David doesn't take throne by killing all of his enemies. His kingship is from above. His kingship is from God. Since David walks with God, he learns from God. And as we can conclude, David walks with God more than he walks with men. It is our nature always to confront to the way the world lives. And if we make world our model, we start to live like world lives. But the way David lives, we see he more conforms with God. He conforms with God more of all. Though he is very busy with people's needs, his heart is dwelling above in God's presence. Yet the man who reports doesn't know this. He expects to obtain David's favor, but instead receives the capital punishment. And then we read in verses 11 and 12, then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. So they took it as a personal tragedy. That was David's true attitude. And he did it not for a show, of course. He was sincere. He cries for his friend Jonathan. He poured out his heart. And the rest of this chapter 1 is his lament song. The song is found its place in the Bible. Since similar words, God laments for his lost friends. This probably shall teach us something. The author of the book reveals to us what does it mean to be the man according to the heart of God. David's heart and God's heart are beating together. Now the story continues. So while David is lamenting and writing his songs, we continue the story and move to chapter 2. And in the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. And it's very important. You know, after all his difficulties in life, he took some time out. But then he turned back to his mission and he asks the question, what's about my mission? What shall I do next? And the Lord said, go up. David asked, where shall I go? To Hebron, the Lord answered. And you remember that was the last city mentioned, because it was the smallest out of that huge list of cities where David sent the gifts and plunder to share with them. And that city, Hebron, was the exact place where David became king. Do you remember this interesting situation with the list of cities and the Hebron at the end? Yet only Hebron was interested to accept David as a ruler. But who could know this? Even David could know this. But God knows. God suggested David to go to Hebron. These folks did not discriminate that David is a shepherd, that he is not of noble birth, and he is a poor guy, because they themselves were shepherds. So, we read next. So David went up there with two of his wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. So first, he became the king of the Jews, David. The other 11 tribes remained silent. They didn't want a shepherd to rule over them. They forgot that it is God who chooses the ruler in Israel. They looked whom to appoint to be their king. So at this moment, David decided to give them a chance. And David initiates the dialogue. He sends his sincere condolences. He respects their grief over King Saul and Jonathan and all the leaders of the army, all generals. And he overturns the disgrace of Saul's house, honoring him. So what we read, now we can see on this picture the kingdom of Judah in yellow and kingdom of Israel in blue. So there were two kingdoms at that time. And we read next. When David was told that it was the man from Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to them to say to them, "The Lord bless you for the showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." Now Saul's supporters had to respond. We would expect them to turn hearts to David. He was sincere when he joined their grieving. He was supporting and compassionate. He is so much speaking to their hearts. So now it's their time naturally to come to him, to accept him. However, one man mixes all plans. So we read in chapter 2, verses 8 to 10, we read, "Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Pakenham." So he actually wanted to rule by himself because he is a very mighty man, the general of Saul's army, next in power after Saul. But he could not because he was not the firstborn son and not a relative even. So he took Ishbosheth, one of Saul's sons, and decided to rule via him. So by his hands. He made him king over Gilead and Ashuri and Jezreel and also of Ephraim, Benjamin and all Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. He was older than David, about 10 years older at that time. However, he couldn't rule successfully in the same way as David did. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. Oh no, again we have two kings. Will they become two rivals? Reading further, we see the attempts of the commanders to clash the armies and fight. Several times they were on the edge of making a civil war. Abner on one side and Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was on the other side. Generals tried to make a battle and to decide by power who will win, whose king is greater. David was the one who held them from fighting. He canceled all their military plans. That was not easy. On one of such occasions, David admits, read these words of David. "And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak. Though I am anointed king, I am weak today. And these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." They were cruel, the sons of Zeruiah. It's really hard when you are chosen to do the job, but there are some who often intervene trying to support you and, however, makes obstacles to your mission. Joab was a very dedicated man, a great commander, but he often intervened with his own opinion. And he did not walk with God. David did walk with God, and Job did not walk with God. He was a man of his time, cunning and cruel. He wanted David to think like everyone else, to be more normal. He probably thought in his heart that it is because of David's romantic nature all enemies are not yet killed and all tribes are not yet in submission. This man would force people to accept David. Neither God nor David wanted this kind of rulership. Only Satan wants this to happen. However, the things appointed by God were slowly coming true. Abner, after a while, realized his mistake. He decided to make peace with David and came to Hebron to dialogue. And again, we expecting peace. Yet it is about a war to break up. Abner was secretly killed by Joab, who performed a blood feud for his brother. At this time, David acts decisively. He orders all people to mourn, and even Joab is forced to mourn and fast by the king's order. Now Joab will see what does it feel to live against your heart, because he wants to force people to do what they don't want to do, to accept the one whom they don't want right now. So David allows him to taste it by himself. David makes any opportunity to name the murderer and to judge him. But he cannot punish Joab. He cannot kill him, execute him, because of the common practice of this time. The blood feud was widely spread in the Middle East, even up to this day. Yet, David's action made people to see beyond their time and beyond their culture. People realized that they have to stop blood feud. They have to stop it immediately. David writes another lament song over Abner. David, was a unique person of his time in noticing people's good features, despite those people were his enemies, even for their life. We would call this characteristic of David impartiality. From this David's action, people learned even more of his greatness and more of God, who was David's shepherd. And we read, only after this, all the people took note and were pleased. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So on that day, all the people there and all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. Even more, people were amazed when David punished to death the killers of King Ishbosheth, who was his rival. David, in fact, did not attack him even once. He let him live and rule over the whole Israel. David gave task to decide who is worthy in God's hands. Now people could compare the rulership of Saul's dynasty, when they were constantly in civil war, and rulership of David, who was not so ambitious and did not make any trouble to his countrymates. David loved life. He knew people in the country have many tasks to do: to build up cities, to shear the sheep, to plant vineyards, to dig wells. David's kingship proposal was that, guys, you work on land and build our economy up, and I, with my army, protect us from external enemies. I am also responsible for keeping justice. This is my job, right? No doubt, this strategy worked. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood." And they'd never been before, but now they accepted it. "In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." So they knew it beforehand. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. So this is a glorious event in the history of Israel. And final point we will look at is David's conquest of Jerusalem. He became the great king, united all tribes, so he needed a central location that shall be a citadel. David looked around and saw Jebusites who lived on the hills. And Jebusites were the last giants. You know, his career began when he overcame the giant, Goliath. And now he will overcome the city of giants. And those giants were enemies of Israel. They were doomed since Deuteronomy. Of course, they didn't submit. They began to laugh at David and his small army, even small, short in size, you know. And what we read, but David said, "Go up." That was what he repeated, you know, because he heard it from God, he learned it, and he said to his army, "Go up." So they need to climb the hills, and they need to conquer the city of giants. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem. At that time, Jerusalem, the city of peace, was the city of giants. And David, with his men, marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. And the Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. So he prevailed, and Jerusalem became the city of David, and he built up the fortress of Zion. And David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terrace inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. Again and again, the author, the prophet, tells us that all David's success comes from God. Some people will view it as a mystery. They say, God gave David sacred knowledge to overcome the enemies and to be in proper time, in proper place. However, I think you agree with me that the main secret was that people loved David as a character, and his character was built up by God. David made God his model and learned from him. His attitude to people silenced their opponents. His way of life made people trust him. People wanted this man and his God to rule over them, to be their king. People wanted it. Now they were not just forced to obey. They wanted him to be their king. People were not afraid. The country started to grow and prosper. In 4 decades, they moved from tribal to feudal mentality. The golden time has come in Israel. and they moved to strong economy and superseded the neighboring countries in glory. Today, I call every one of us employ David's example. Walk with God. Learn from God. Make your mindset like that of God. This is what we call getting ready. And once in the proper time, when we are ready, He will call us into His home in eternity. Amen.